When you're going to insert your pedals into the crank, one thing to look, your crank may say left or right. Right here, it's upside down, but you can see there's an R stamped onto it. There's also arrows telling you to rotate this way when you're installing the pedal. When you get your pedals, look at them. You'll see one pedal will have a marking for left, and the other one will have a marking for right. Also, you'll notice that the ring on this pedal is one color, and over here it's a different color. These nuts are specifically for these shafts, so don't mix this nut onto this one or this one to this one. They won't go on, and you may damage the threads on the pedal if you do mix them. So keep them separate. Right now we're going to be installing the right crank. You can see right here the R. So here, the R. What I'm going to do is I'm going to remove this nut from this pedal shaft. In this case, I can remove it by hand. So if you encounter a situation where you can't get the nut to release, it may be that the nut was over tightened when they put it onto the shaft. That does not mean that it's stuck to the pedal. All you have to do is get the included tools, get the wrench that holds this section, the square section of the pedal, and set it there. Then get the second wrench and come here and loosen the nut with the wrench. This will give you enough leverage to remove it. One thing to notice for the right pedal is when I'm removing it, I'm rotating it counterclockwise. When you're looking straight at the shaft, you'll turn it counterclockwise to remove it. So here I'm going to install the right pedal shaft into the right crank, and once again, rotating it clockwise. So the top section of the shaft will be rotating forward. Here, I'm going to align the hole and start turning the shaft, the top rolling over. You should be able to do this mostly by hand. If you encounter too much resistance, it may be that you're crossing the threads, and you'll want to back the shaft out and then try aligning again. Here I've got it most of the way through the hole. Now I'm just going to use a wrench to help me. I'm going to turn it clockwise, and now I have it tight. Now I'm going to get the nut that I removed from this specific pedal, and when I put this nut on, I'm going to be rotating it counterclockwise. So the top of the nut will be rolling back. You can see I'm pulling my finger across the top of the nut to rotate it onto the crank pedal. And now that it's tight, I want to make sure that there is no gap. Right now you can see that there's a small gap between the nut and the pedal crank. I'll use the two wrenches to tighten up the pedal and the nut. So with the one wrench, I will hold the square section of the pedal that's on this side of the crank, on the outside of the crank. Then I will come with the other wrench and get the nut. And like I said, I will rotate the nut backwards, counterclockwise, to tighten it. Now that it's been tightened, you'll see that there's no gap between the crank and the pedal shaft. And then on this side, you'll see that there's no gap between the nut and the pedal crank. So here, I'm going to install the left pedal. There's an L stamped on the pedal onto the left crank. There's an L stamped on the crank. It's upside down from your point of view. There's little arrows pointing for the direction that you have to turn the pedal shaft as you're inserting it into the hole. Here I'm going to use one wrench to hold the shaft, and then the second wrench to release it. And now the nut is off. I will now install this pedal shaft into the crank by rotating the shaft in a counterclockwise direction. I've done it mostly by hand. I'm going to use a tool now. Just rotate it until the crank stops me from tightening any further. Now I'm going to get the pedal nut and attach it to the back side of the crank. And when I'm installing this one, I'm going to be installing it in a clockwise direction. So I'm causing the nut to roll back. The top of the nut is rolling back. And I've gotten it on as much as I can by hand. And I will now come with the wrench, hold the square section of the pedal, and then with the second wrench I will tighten the nut further. Now that that's done, make sure that there is no gap between this shaft and the crank and the nut and the crank.